Hey and welcome back. In this lesson we are going to try and solve our camera track. So we've placed our trackers and we have quite a few trackers. We've got 15 trackers and they're all looking pretty good. And now we can go ahead and try and solve our camera motion or our camera move. And then Blender is going to give us a tracking score. And if we get a really bad score, we can refine our track a little bit, which I will cover in a next lesson. But for this lesson, we're just going to look at how to solve our camera track and how to view the error or the result error basically. So to do this, we are going to go to this little solve tab right here on the left hand side of the viewport. And then you'll see we've got solve, and then underneath that we've got all these settings. So there's only a few things we need to worry about in this drop down. So first of all, there's a button that says tripod or a checkbox, tripod. And that is if your camera was on a tripod and it's literally just a pan left to right or maybe a pan up and down, but the camera is staying in the exact same spot. So if you are using a tripod shot, just tick that. Obviously this shot was not done on a tripod, it's a drone shot, so the camera is actually moving through space, so we're not going to bother with ticking that. Next we've got keyframe. Now this is basically the area of your shot that Blender will kind of look at to try and determine the perspective change in the shot. So by default it's set to 1 and 30, so it's only going to look at this small section of the footage to try and determine the perspective in your shot. So usually I leave this on default 1 to 30, but if you get a really bad solve error, you can always try and adjust this. The rule of thumb here is try and select 2 keyframes in your shot with the most perspective change. So let's say the camera is fairly still in the beginning and maybe there's a big camera move maybe between frame 60 and 90 showing the perspective a little bit better. Then I would suggest you change frame A to say 60 and frame B to let's say frame 90. So it's just kind of looking for the most perspective changes in the shot, and because this shot is it's kind of very similar throughout, it's not really going fast or slow, or it's not changing perspective in a certain area, it's kind of doing the same thing all the way through. So I think a keyframe of 1 and 30 should work fine. Next up we have our focal length, and this means that Blender can actually go ahead and change that focal length that we inserted here under the camera lens settings. Remember we set this to 28mm focal length. Now this checkbox means that Blender can actually go ahead and it can refine that number a little. So if you're not 100% sure about the focal length, you can always check that box, and as I say, Blender will try and kind of refine that. But for this shot we know the setting should be right, and that's why we don't want Blender to change that focal length, so I'm not going to tick it. The same goes with optical center and also the radial distortion. Now by default I'm going to leave them off as well because we don't want Blender to change the radial distortion or the optical center for these camera settings. So I'm going to leave them all off. So all you need to do is click on this solve camera motion button, and now Blender is going to kind of go through and calculate everything, and right here at the top you'll see it says solve error, and it's giving me a solve error of 0.11 pixel, which is a really good result basically. So this number is in pixels, so it's basically 0.11 pixel error, which means there's a slight error of almost 0.1 pixels. So it's extremely small, which means there's not a lot of error. You always want your solve error to be lower than 1 pixel. If your solve error is let's say 5 or 10, that means that your camera track is off by, or it can actually glide or move around by 10 pixels outside of that tracking area. So always try and get a solve error that's lower than 1 pixel. Anything above 1 is not that great, and you want to try and get that lower. So obviously with this example We got a great solve error of 0.1, but in the next lesson I'm going to show you how to refine that if you got a really bad track. Now just something quickly I want to show you before we end this lesson. If we look at our tracks here at the top, you can see they've got these numbers now next to each track. And this number is the solve error for each individual track. So you can see this one here at the bottom's got a solve error of 0.05, which is really small, which is great. And if you go through them, they're all really great. You can see this one is slightly higher than the others, 0.10, which is still great. The highest one is this one at the top, which has got an error of 0.23, which is still way smaller than 1, so it's still perfectly fine. But you can see if I click on this tracker, it will actually highlight that track in the viewport, and we can now see that this tracker is giving us the highest error of all our tracks. So if we would say delete this tracker and maybe track something else, we will get a better overall score. But for now, I really don't think we should do anything there because this solve error is great. But in the next lesson, I'm going to show you what to do if you get a really bad solve error. So for now, this is perfect. And yeah, you can go ahead and save your project for now. And I will see you in the next lesson.